Kia ora tātou. I'm just presumably someone will sort of give me a wave when the minister arrives. You'll do that. Cheers, thanks very much. Right, well, it's always like coming in here. I just thought the other day when I came into the library that as they sell off our pubs and our churches, the library becomes the sort of spiritual centre of the society. So I have this sort of image of the place with sort of a bar and an altar at some stage, and we can sort of concentrate ourselves here. Right, now throughout life I find that you read books very, very occasionally that completely change the way you look at things or add in some ways to things that you already knew. And I've been incredibly lucky in the last month to read two of these books. The first one was Vincent O'Malley's The Great War for New Zealand, and the second one was Philip's. Now, I've known about Philip and his work previously. We're both old Department of Conservation employees, both first dayers, both started on the first day, both abandoned ships a little bit early too, I think, but we won't go into that. And I always joked when I was with Doc that as an anthropologist I was always much more interested in the fact that there was a society called the Royal Society for the Protection of Forests and Birds, rather than forests and birds themselves. So it was the people side of it. And so when AUP sent me a copy of Philip's latest book, I was thrilled to see that well over half of it, in fact, was, did in fact include a large sort of human component. But surprisingly, what I found, and this was the new addition to my world, was that it was the first part that enthralled me. It was the description of the tree, of the natural side of it, rather than the sort of the human side. And right outside our door, or in fact just outside our gate, is a reasonably sized Tōtara tree. And what I found as I was reading Philip's book, that I was popping outside regularly to have a look at this tree, and it was like somebody had introduced me to a new friend. It was this thing that had been there for so long suddenly became a lot more interesting, knowing what was going on inside it. Absolutely fascinating. Now, what I'd like to do now is hand over to Philip, if that's okay with you. I was hoping that the minister would be here by this stage, but we'll move on to the next bit. And Philip, would you like to come and have a word or three?
Right. Kia ora, thank you, David. Thank you, Ian, and I welcome all of the associates. Well, it's a wonderful crowd. It's a wonderful pleasure for me to be the centre of attention briefly in Devonport. I had a speech which sort of started off with a joke about the minister, so I can't really do that. So I'll have to just make it up. But anyway, so I welcome you and thank you all for coming. And I've got members of my family here. I've got two of my siblings, my sister Janine and my brother Peter, and they have been amazingly important in my life and the reason for me being here. My sister Janine, we grew up in a very, very rural environment. Even today it's a rural environment, but 70 years ago it was super rural. And we just had to look after ourselves pretty much. Our nearest neighbours were literally miles away. We caught the school bus to get to school. It took an hour or more to get there and back again. So we looked after ourselves, and my sister Janine took up the family interest of collecting plants and in particular ferns for the older members of my family. And she presented me at one time, I think because she moved on to more important things perhaps, with her collection, her herbarium specimens. And they were beautifully pressed, dried specimens of native trees like rata, for instance. I remember one of them was, and she had some orchids in there too that somebody had given her, and that fired my imagination, as you could well expect. But and you will know that herbarium specimens can last for hundreds of years. The oldest specimen of Tōtara was collected in 1827.
Could you
So,
use the microphone a bit more?
oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, right. And so it was Janine, my sister, who started this passion and interest in collecting native plants, classifying native plants, and it's gone on and on till the present day. My brother Peter's interests were totally different. He was a bookman, and he collected books and classified books. Black Beauty was number 17. But he crossed that out, and it became, I think, number 23. But it didn't matter to me whether it was 17 or 23. The fact of the matter was that he could find it again out of all of his books. But he used to tell me stories. We slept together for years because we were rural and poverty-stricken. And it wasn't a big bed either. It wasn't a king-size bed. It was a less than full bed. And so we were close. And he would tell me stories every single night. Every single night. Well, I'm sure some nights he didn't, but it seemed every single night. These were imaginary stories about animals in nature, and birds nesting was one of the most key and exciting things, of finding a blue egg in a little nest. And but the point to be made about that is that I learned not only from Janine how to press native plants, but I learned from Peter how to tell stories. And so now I tell stories about pressed plants. So I thank them. So they are here, and Peter's wife Helen is here. And I have some of my children here too, Adam and Shelley, and Adam's wife Sue, and Shelley and her husband Joost, and two of my grandchildren are here too. And I was going to conclude my speech with a message to my grandchildren, but I'll sort of do it now because we're speaking in general terms. That there's a television program on at the moment about the technological future. Many of you will have watched it in awe and horror, possibly, but many will have watched it in awe about what is going to happen to us in the coming decades. And I was sort of looking at my book while watching this television program, and I suddenly thought, well, what is going to happen to these books? And I ended up feeling very good because I loved the feel of the book and how it looks and its weight and so on. So I said to myself, and I was thinking about my grandchildren, well, I want them. I'm pleased that they're coming here to this event tonight because I want them to share their experiences and take their lives into the future through writing or the equivalent. So I'm thrilled that they are here tonight to participate in this. The other member of my family is my wife Wendy, and one doesn't write books on one's own. Writing a book is a dedication that borders on fanaticism, and this one has been fanatical for quite a long period of time, longer than I would like, really. But never mind. Wendy has stood by my side and said, "Good show, go for it, carry on." She said, "Don't worry about coming home from Warkworth or somewhere, because I'm looking after the place," and that includes all sorts of things like vegetable gardens and plants and sheep and our bush and so on and so forth. And not only that, Wendy's a scientist herself. She's a wine scientist, or a wine sensory scientist, and she studies phenomena like how a wine tastes. And she tends to talk about everybody having a sort of a different palate, and that the taste of a wine is really a qualitative phenomenon rather than something that one can quantify and graph in a series of points. The point being there that scientific information is tricky stuff. It's not just facts. And one has to be very, very careful in reaching some of the conclusions that you liked, which I took the liberty to make, because nobody has made some of these conclusions before. Because it's very difficult to know what conclusions to make based on the evidence you've got. So Wendy would be constantly reminding me, "Philip, be cognizant of the facts and don't make silly conclusions that are not grounded well in real science." And so that has been a theme that I've benefited from all the way through. Well, I'll carry on because one never knows about these ministers. And I want to say about the people who have helped me with this book, because while a lot of the observations are my own of nature, virtually all of the stuff has come through the help of other people. And first up in my mind is a gentleman here, Brian Butterfield, an old teacher of mine from Canterbury University. He became the professor of the department and head of the school at Canterbury, and he took me on board in a most important way. He invited me to be a visiting academic to Canterbury. Now, I live in the Wop Wops. There's a lovely little library, not quite as elaborate as this, and it is the spiritual centre of Tākaka as well. But it doesn't have internet connections to the international literature. Canterbury University does. And for a book like this, with an international element to it, which is immutable, it cannot be done without a knowledge of botany of the world and the botanists of the world. Having that link through the university library is absolutely vital, and I thank you, Brian, for that opportunity. Not only that formal opportunity, but Brian came with me on a number of field trips, one notable one to South Westland, which is a very important place for Tōtara in New Zealand. Set me up at camp in the university field centre at Harihari there, and helped me very greatly. So that was one person. Another person that I'd like to mention, whose embarrassingly photograph occurs in the book 4 times. I don't know quite how that happened. It just means that he was standing in places that are so important. His name is Kevin Jones. He's an archaeologist. And he came with me on a number of trips. And he, with his Maori connections, he was able to introduce me to communities of kaumatua and leaders. One of the memorable ones, I was sitting around in a room at Murupara on the Waikato River, and the man there had recently benefited from a decent-sized Waitangi tribunal.
Settlement.
What's the word?
Settlement.
Settlement, thank you. And he said, well, we're planting Tōtara in Whirinaki, and our timetable is 1,000 years. And I thought, well, good. That's a good idea. And so that's a new sort of philosophy that's crept in. Doc has to deal with the philosophy of just 2 or 3 years. But so the Maori groups that have been empowered, are working for the long term. And it reminds me of a story that I talked a bit on the radio. Somebody rang in when I was talking with Jesse Mulligan yesterday and asked about these waka trees. Is it true? And because in the archaeological circles, some archaeologists have denied the very existence of these things because they're so remarkable. These are trees that were trained by physical modification to grow into semi sort of waka. It needed a bit of work, of course, over a period of several hundred years, and they were passed down through the families or through conquering for generations to generations, and that's another example of this sort of huge scale planning that went on. I was assisted by members of the Maori community right throughout New Zealand, and a few names come to mind. There's a man who lives at Tihi Ropinga, for instance, near Puriora. His name is John Paki, and he runs a trust which is the basis of a tourism venture. And his tourism venture is a trail that goes from giant Tōtara to giant Tōtara, and they're nearly all Tōtara trees that have been modified for, not waka, but for bird collecting baskets. And you've got these ancient trees of 500 or 600 years old showing the scars of a former culture, a bird hunting forest culture. And it's so remarkably different from the forest culture that I belong to, which is trying to get the birds back. But in those days, there were rules about all this sort of thing, and while unnecessary extinction took place, especially early on in the Polynesian settlement of the country, it eventually resulted in a very powerful conservation ethic, and he is now modifying that for the human enjoyment of the Tōtara forest. Well, he was one. I'll just have to refer to my list of people because there's some others I'd like to mention. James Rickard is one of the bosses at the Rotorua Carving School, and I spent a lot of time in the book dealing with Tōtara as the base for Maori carving. And James Rickard is a master carver, and he took me in and showed me the work, and that was most enjoyable. Well, I'll cease this rambling discourse because people more important than myself have arrived.
You have done so well.
And so I'm going to now welcome the Minister of Conservation. How do you do?
Very well, very good, lovely to be here. Hello. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I-
Sorry to interrupt proceedings, here we go.
You're not interrupting.
I'm
You're next.
Oh, good, right,
Yeah.
good, gotcha.
I'm going to welcome the Minister of Conservation, and I'll just tell a little joke. I have known or had dealings with the Minister for 20 odd years, when she was a gardener, Maggie's Garden Show.
Right.
And I'd been dealing with the cabbage tree, and I got invited to be part of a story on the cabbage tree on her show. And so we went out into a beautiful paddock of cabbage trees, and I was mildly disappointed by the fact that I wasn't going to be interviewed by you at all.
Oh, not that one.
It was by your friend Bill. And, so I was a little negative about it, but it turned out that Bill was a bit of a disaster because I was talking away about cabbage trees in a most eloquent manner, and Bill literally fell off his chair.
Had he been at the drink?
I think he must have been, because not only that, he forgot all his lines.
Oh, no.
But I told him what to say, and it all worked out well in the end.
Sounds familiar.
We all had an enjoyable day, so I thank you for that. And now you're Minister of Conservation, and that's dear to my heart, because Tōtara and every other New Zealand plant and animal desperately needs conserving, and it needs a minister at the helm who's got a finger on the pulse. So I think Honourable Barry has a finger on the pulse, and we're just going to have a little listen to just how your pulse works.
I appreciate it. Very good.
Use the mic, Maggie.
I will use the mic. You might wonder why I'm bringing this big bag in here, Philip. It's all down to you.
Oh, I see.
Yes. So not only do I know that Philip has had an extraordinarily rich history in writing about our own wonderful books, including The Cabbage Tree and the Pahuta Kawa and the Rata, which I have had for many years and love to bits, and now this Totara one, but also not perhaps as well known a fact as you wrote your dissertation, I think, on the Joshua tree.
I did.
Which is not a tree we know a whole lot about in this country. But kia ora, everybody. Yeah, there we go. That's it. I'll just settle down. I've just come from another meeting. My apologies to be late. But inga mana, inga reo, e rauranga tera mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It is with great pleasure that I am here tonight to welcome this weighty tome into the world. It weighs as much as a newborn, which is why I've been lugging this bag around with me all day today. I was over in New York at the Oceans Conference last week, and there were 7,000 delegates, 100 ministers, and 193 countries represented. All of them had very similar problems around the ocean and the marine pollution, and also many of them had the sort of threat that we are enduring now around our native kauri and around our native Pūtakawa, the members of the myrtle tree. So it's been a very, in some ways uplifting and in other ways discouraging encounter to understand that so many people around the world are coping with things that really we can't deal with in an eradication way. The myrtle rust, as many of you might have heard, was found today or last night and confirmed in Te Puke. So we now know it probably came in Taranaki, windborne from Australia, where it's been for the past 7 years, and it then was in Kerikeri, and now it's in Te Puke. And I'd have to say, Raoul Island, and I'm sure you have been there, there's certainly photographs of it in your book. It's up in the Kermadex, which is one of the topics of conversation we had in the United Nations last week, trying to get as many marine protected areas and reserves as possible around the world as one response to safeguarding our wonderful specimens, whether they're on the terrestrial landscape or whether they are below the waves. But your contribution has been stellar, and I'd have to say, having read this book, and it was done by Te Papa Press, which now comes under me in Arts, Culture, Heritage. So this is the perfect coming together of my two portfolios, and seniors, because I feel like a senior most days, and I've got glasses now to prove it. So, but whether, I'm not sure how excited I am, whether I'm more excited to be Minister of Arts, Culture and Heritage being here launching this, or conservation. Because to understand and to know what a tree does and how it lives and how the ecosystem fits together and how even the mighty Tōtara is not alone, it needs the supporting acts around it, and it supports so much life. And with our kauri trees, I was up north a few weeks ago witnessing the horror of the kauri dieback. We have closed tracks, we've built boardwalks, we've done what we can to educate people and give them the idea that they are part of the problem, because you can spread it as a vector yourself. You know, this microscopic spore clings to the soles of your shoes and can be carried through our forests. And but it's about educating and winning hearts and minds that really makes the difference. And that's where you come in, Philip, because when you read a book like this, or even pick it up from time to time and look at the pictures and understand the broad realm, then you know better how everything fits together and how important it is that we are vigilant. And I feel that, frankly, the Tōtara, as one of the most magnificent trees, has deserved its own book for a long time. And I'm so glad that you've taken not only a scholarly approach, which is telling us about the plant and how we need to know its history and so forth, but also about how it's used in New Zealand and how it's beloved of us, and how most of the wonderful carvings that we see in museums throughout the land have been carved with Tōtara. It is the most remarkable tree, and the paddles that they used in the waka to get rid of the water, there are very few trees that can withstand that amount of water and still be functioning and intact hundreds and hundreds of years later. So the magnificence of the Tōtara has not been as well understood as it is since you have written this book and that we are launching here tonight. And I know that from the first Maori who arrived here, we know the history of it, but again, Philip, you've pulled it all together, that the Tōtara logs had washed down onto the beaches, and when the Maori came here, no doubt exhausted from their journeying, and saw these remarkable logs and knew that they were completely suitable for making waka and voka for the Pacifica nations as well, to sail long distances in, I think was something of a game changer for our early Maori settlers. And they have used the Tōtara in all its very many forms for many years. And I spoke to a guy up north who'd actually seen a Tōtara that still had the markings of when the bark was removed from it to store for, I think it was the mutton birds or other birds that they were trying to preserve. And to have that link with something that was a practice, many hundreds of years ago, still in a tree that exists and was not knocked back by it, I think is I love their longevity. I love their ability to just soldier on no matter what has been thrown at it, and a lot has been. I think that a lot of our houses and our fences are built from Tōtara. And I had a property some years ago in the Wairarapa, and they brought pheasants out from the old land. It was built in 1880s, but they used Tōtara posts, and they must have cut down a horrifying amount of them to use these Tōtara posts that were twice as deep in the ground as they were high, and they were resilient even 100 years later. But they kept the pheasants in, and they brought box trees over. You know the box hedges that we have? I couldn't believe it. I had a box tree that had been let to go, and it was about 5 metres high, and a lovely tree. And normally it's this poor little stumpy thing that we all cut very hard, and is a marvellous tree, hedge in our gardens, but it's prone to a disease too. I suppose I'm giving you a broad general impression of, for me as a gardener, as someone who loves plants and who came to conservation early, it was through our native flora. And our magnificent trees are not as well understood as they could be. And we still don't know what it is that's killing them. But I know, Tōtara, fortunately, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have its own disease yet. It hasn't, which is something that no one would wish on any specimen. But it is happening increasingly, and our need to understand and preserve and protect our forest giants, I think, has never been more important. And we are trying to regenerate and to replant them. And the dreaded possum, frankly, Tōtara would not be the most appealing plant, I would think. You know, when you think of cleanthus and our kakabeak and our succulent caviar that slugs and snails are drawn to automatically. But the down possum has decimated our Totara trees. And there was a time, in fact, in my former life you referred to, on the garden show, where with Project Crimson, we thought all Pōhutukawa would be lost in the north because of the ravages of the possum. And, you know, there are very solid reasons why it was chosen, along with rats and stoats, to be the top 3 predators that we want to eradicate. And I commend any of you who are in the audience tonight who are part of the Environment Devonport group to try and get rid of possums and stoats and rats, because we all need to join forces to make that happen. And even the mighty Totara could be knocked back badly by this introduced vermin, which of course in Australia they want to protect. I figure if we send over a few thousand of them in a container and, you know, send them over to Australia, that will solve both our problems. But protecting our natural taonga is one of the things that I think probably unifies all of us who admire and love the forests. I think of them always as my cathedrals of green. It's when I become my most patriotic. Even in New York last week, I saw some cabbage trees and some Pōhutukawa, and I felt that I had a connection with my homeland and with the sense of who we are as New Zealanders. So they tell a lot about us. We use them in the best possible sense. We need to protect them when we need them, and this book will aid and abet a lot of greater understanding about this particular tree. And I wanted to talk a little bit as well from the arts culture perspective about having a Michael King fellowship, and that was, I think this wonderful book is an outcome of your time there. And I think we've had about 13 major writers who have been at the Writers' Centre and who have had the access to the grant, the fellowship. It is the fellowship is our largest in New Zealand. It's $100,000, and frankly, that doesn't go far enough to help write books. But I know from my friend Owen Marshall, he said you can work all year. For 3 years, you might only get. And Peter, hello to you too. I'm not going to start commenting on finances and books, and you've had a wonderfully successful book on the Christchurch Bloomsbury set recently, of course. But you know, these books, and they take time to do. And Owen said, you know, he would spend a year on a book and he might only get $25,000, you know, and it is difficult. So for me as the Minister of Arts and Culture and Heritage, to be able to see the end outcome of $100,000 darn well spent as an investment in our enrichment in our literature sense. But these fellowships are important, and I'm very proud that the Michael King House is such a nurturing place for so many writers as well who have come here. And the late Michael King was somebody who I admired very much and who worked very hard, I think, to awaken Pākehā New Zealanders to the richness of the history of you know, Te Puia was one. Being Pākehā changed the way I thought about myself and my country, and Moriori as well, in the way that your books have changed many things as well, in the way that we perceive and honour our noble trees in particular. But I am pleased that that Writers' Fellowship enabled you as a non-fiction writer to do what you do so well, and I congratulate you on the superb culmination of many years of work, and I'm really personally delighted too that this fellowship has enabled you to turn a lifelong love of the Tōtara into a book that exudes that love and that sense of wider and strong connection. I congratulate you, Sam Elworthy, and the team for having the good sense to publish this through Auckland University Press. And I must say, with the Ockham Book Awards this year, and really enjoyed a lot of the festival events, as I'm sure many of you did, but we need to have these big festivals and these events, and then you see what the university presses and the other publishing companies are doing to support works like these. It is incredibly important, the role that you play in New Zealand literature, and I thank you for all your efforts in that regard. So you're our Auckland taonga, and we have Fergus Barrowman in Victoria, but thank you, Philip, for what you do. So this wonderful book, Tōtara, A Natural and a Cultural History, is a significant natural history record and a unique non-fictional work, and I'm sure, like all your others, destined to be an award winner and to be acknowledged by New Zealand. And I want to thank you, Philip, for writing it on behalf of myself, the readers here today, and for future generations who will admire and treasure this taonga of a book. So I officially declare it open, if that's what you do with a book. Shall I open the book? And it falls at a page that has wonderful history in it. It is a grand book, and I'd like you all to join me in thanking Philip for writing it and putting so much energy and talent into it.
Thank you very much, Minister. That's very kind. And I just want to carry on with my talk, but pick up your words about the funding to write this book. Before the Michael King Fellowship was applied for and received, I got the first leg up from the Friends of Turnbull Library. And is Jim in the audience? Hello, Jim. Jim is one of the Friends of the Turnbull, and they graciously gave me, it didn't compare in scale with the Michael King, but it was enough for me to be able to confidently write more applications for funding. And so that was the most, and also very esoteric. It was beautiful to be recognised by the Turnbull Library. And I thank the Friends of Turnbull very, very much. I've used the Turnbull Library extensively for all of my work. It's just such a wonderful collection of manuscripts and books and artworks and photographs and so on. So that was wonderful. But getting the Michael King was just a game changer for my game. It gives you enough money to devote yourself to perhaps it didn't expect to be devoted for quite so many years as it happened, but it does. It gives you a full-time capacity. So I was able to travel throughout the country looking at natural groves of Tōtara and learning about the ecology of them, meeting the people who in the dock offices and so on were looking after the forests and the trees, letting them take me to very special places which otherwise would be invisible to me and so on. So that money was wonderful, and it even allowed me, and Dave, taking up the universal part of the work, the international botany, it allowed me to go to Tasmania, for instance, and climb up high into the alpine parks there and see the tiny little relatives of Tōtara growing there among the marsupials and so on. It was quite extraordinary. And while I think Michael King was well spent by the time I got to go east, young man, to Chile, it was so wonderful. Chile, like New Zealand, is a remnant of Gondwana land, and you get there the most ancient of trees. And this is where the relatives of Tōtara began. And it was just so wonderful to have the money to be able to go and visit these places. Now, I was just thanking a few people, and I think it's blatantly obvious that without a community of friends and helpers, books like this cannot be written. So I'll just, in general, say thank you to them. And I wanted to just come to the book itself. When I published the Cabbage Tree book, the publisher said, Philip, this book is a dog's breakfast. And I thought, well, I sort of quite like dogs' breakfasts, not quite appreciating what he said. So I carried on making dogs' breakfasts, and I gave another one to Sam. And Sam didn't quite say anything, but he and his team turned my dog's breakfast into a gourmet lunch. So I thank Sam and Auckland University Press, not only for stimulating this book, helping me with the funding, but the team has done a magnificent job through the editorial process. That was one phase that one has to get through, get it to the size and shape that is publishable, the reality of the modern world. But more than that are the people that were involved, and the feeling and structure and manner of this book was in the hands of Katrina Duncan, and I will be forever grateful to her and others as well, but to Katrina in particular. Just as a final word, I just want to say I dedicated this book to two of my colleagues. One was Jeff Park, who wrote Ngā Uru Ora, which was, perhaps if you could say that this was a personal statement of mine, Ngā Uru Ora was a personal statement about Kahikatea by Jeff Park. But Jeff took the passion of conservation and the science of conservation botany, and he brought them together so that political people could understand, yourself excluded because you already did. But frankly, people like the Prime Minister, Mr. Muldoon, needed a scientific understanding of conservation in order to move forward, and he did. And Jeff Park laid the basis for that. And I dedicated this book also to my boss in the first DG of conservation, Ken Piddington, who has tragically also died. Ken saw the bicultural world as the only reality for New Zealand. He was a fluent Maori speaker himself, but more than that, he believed in it, and he made absolutely certain, Dave, that the Maori connection in the Department of Conservation was standing side by side with the Pākehā interests. And I loved him for him giving me the opportunity to share in that philosophy. Jeff Park gave me opportunities to study esoteric matters, not esoteric, but qualitative matters like landscape and so on in the New Zealand context. So I thank them deeply. And I just want to pass on to three other people who have passed away that all feature in my book. David Galloway is a lichenologist, a lichen expert, who was in the middle of revising an enormous tome on the classification of lichens, a wonderful man. Tony Whitaker was New Zealand's expert in the world of lizards, and he helped me greatly understanding the role of Tōtara, or at least the potential role of Tōtara in the life of lizards. And there was an historian and photographer, Les Wright, who lived on the West Coast, who sent me photographs as well. And Les came to his grief while camping and loving Puriora forest in the centre, the heart of Tōtara. So I just pay tribute to colleagues who have influenced me and who have passed on.
Kia ora.
Well, I've said enough. I thank you, Minister, for coming. It's wonderful for you to do so, and I love having my book being given a damn good send-off. Thank you, Sam, for your tolerance and the time it has taken. I hope it worked well for you. And thank you to my wife, Wendy, for standing by me for a long period of time and hopefully into the future as well. Thank you all.
Philip, thank you. It just sort of reminds me that when I was working in DOC, most people who are working in DOC don't have a job, they have a mission from God. And it's nice to see that it continues after retirement. You just never give up. It's something you've been born into. Now, finally tonight, I'd just like to ask someone who's turned a few of my dog breakfasts into something that turned into a book. Sam Elworthy from AUP, if you'd like to come and just finish us off. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dave, and thanks for launching the book, Minister. Much appreciated, and Philip for writing it. And I was only going to say that I thought what I was just thinking about this evening is what's wonderful up on the stage, and I'll focus on these two actually, and you just a little bit. But it's fun as a publisher. I worked in America for a long time in publishing, and America's a large enough country that if you work in it, you tend to be a specialist. You know, in publishing, you're a specialist in biology books or political science books, and if you're a biologist, you're a specialist in cell biology or whatever it is. And in New Zealand, we have this very rare species, which I think may be endemic to this country, which is this sort of intellectual omnivore. And if I look behind me, this man here, Dave Vert, has written marvellous books for me about an anthropologist by training. He's written a great book on archaeology for kids, who knows an enormous amount about the history of New Zealand cooking, which is also a wonderful book. He knows also about toys, about printing presses, and that sort of ability to cross disciplines between history and archaeology and anthropology and food science, or whatever we call that, is a unique thing to this country, and it's a marvellous to see it flourish. And I'd say the same about Philip, that when he described his childhood growing up with Peter there telling him stories and writing about New Zealand's literature, and his sister, whose name I've forgotten, I'm afraid, Janine, making the start of a herbarium collection, is again that intellectual omnivorousness that you'll find in the Tōtara book. I just found a revelation as a publisher, because botany is really hard, actually, it turns out, like how seeds and plants evolve from sort of the primordial scum to these huge, podocarps and these centuries and 1,000-year-old trees we have in this country is complicated. And Philip, to range from being a botanist to being a great a man with huge insight into the Maori world, in both myth and folklore of the Maori world, but also into just basic practices of carving and waka building and so on. And then to tell us a whole lot about our Pākehā history too, of using this wood in my home on the floor and many other places around the Totara, is again, it's a rare breed of person who can be so omnivorous and bring all those things together in a book, and it makes it a real revelation. And just a pleasure for me as a publisher to be able to deal with such fantastic authors. And I'd say also thanks to our minister that we're very lucky to have a minister who deals with both conservation and culture and heritage at the same time, which are so well combined in this book, and to have us protecting both built heritage of Maori and Pākehā in this country, and our natural heritage together is really important, and you see it in the Totara book. So lovely to have you all here tonight, and thanks to the Devonport Library Associates for having us here. And Rachel over here has a very few copies of the book remaining, because it's been running hot, but she will either sell them to you, and Philip is happy to sign them, but she'll also take orders if we run out. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Sam. Sir,
You have your word.
my word is, the next word will be...
Very good.
Well, look, on behalf of the Devonport Library Associates, it's my pleasure to say we've had a fantastic evening. We're on a golden run at the moment. Every time I come here, something fantastic happens, and tonight's been utterly wonderful. Just to reflect that, first we've had the honour from Auckland University Press to give us the honour of introducing such a significant book, both in our cultural and our natural history, is an honour, and thank you, Sam, thank you very much for that. Second person, of course, I'd like to thank is Dave. He's a local treasure. He's a local treasure. Yeah. And Dave, on behalf of the Devonport... he's got the green one. Okay. Thank you, and best wishes from all of us.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And to Maggie, it's wonderful to have a minister who's here. And we know as a result of you being here that you will fight some of the causes that have been espoused tonight. So it's a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to have you as our local MP and the Minister, and we hope that this turns out to be a productive evening.
Oh, no. Queue up in an orderly fashion, you know, I'll try and do everything I can. Thank you very much.
And finally to Philip. I was given this book about 3 weeks ago, and I just picked it up and I read it from cover to cover. And it's a privilege to read. I mean, it's in 3 very distinct sections, and those 3 sections give an absolutely comprehensive picture of this remarkable creature we have growing all around us. It honours that creature, and it honours New Zealand in its own way as well. So Philip, I was going to give a plug for selling the book here. I don't need to do it. You expect that from the publisher, and he delivered. But it's been an absolute pleasure. I had some notes here and I was going to say, no, I just said cover to cover, and really it's been remarkable to have you here. You're going to go back to Takaka, and I hope that you have happy memories of your time in Devonport. On behalf of Devonport Library, and that's it.